In the first presentation given by Gregor, we will start looking around the corpse of a great politician. Dr. Moder is a philosopher working as senior research associate at the Department of Philosophy at the University of Ljubljana. His works include Hegel and Spinoza, A Substance and Negativity, published with Northwestern University Press in 2017, and Antigone, an essay on Hegel's political philosophy, published this year in German by Thuria and Kant. Furthermore, he has edited the volumes The Object of Comedy in 2020, The Ethics of Ernst Lubitsch in 2024, and The Resilience of History, also in 2024. The title of his talk today is Caesar's Wounds.
So thank you very much, Björn, for this wonderful introduction and for the wonderful invitation. This is a lovely place, this temple. And in the words of a character of Ernst Lubitsch's film called To Be or Not to Be, it's, you know, one of the many desires of people anywhere is to perform Shakespeare in the land of William Shakespeare, whatever. So I'll use that opportunity to read a little bit from Shakespeare as well. So having said all that, let me just start. I'll read a paper, and if I'm too fast or too slow, you know, you're free to, what was it, throw cabbages at me? Please don't. Okay, so here goes. Historical and dramatical accounts diverge in details, but it seems that Julius Caesar is dead. According to both Plutarch and Shakespeare, he was killed on the Senate floor by a handful of conspirators who wanted to defend the Roman Republic against the rule of a tyrant, of a would-be king. Marcus Junius Brutus, surrounded by other conspirators proudly displaying their bloody hands, takes to the streets of Rome and explains the reasons for their deed. His ancestors once expelled the last king from Rome and helped found the Republic. And he, Marcus Junius Brutus, personally enjoys great respect as a public servant. As such, Brutus is sure to win the approval of the people, and he does initially. However, he and the other conspirators make one fatal mistake. They agree that General Mark Antony, Caesar's closest ally, should lead the funeral procession and that he too should be allowed to speak to the people of Rome. Brutus and most of the other Republicans assume that Mark Antony is a soldier whose oratory skills are no match for those of seasoned senators. Moreover, they seem to rely too much on the assumption that people are naturally opposed to tyranny and love their own freedom. Obviously, Brutus did not read Spinoza, for otherwise he would have known better. He would have known that men often fight as stubbornly for their servitude as if were their salvation. In William Shakespeare's dramatization of historical events, Mark Antony delivers a speech worthy of a Mephistopheles. He uses many excellent rhetorical devices and strategies, masterfully plays with his audience's expectations, and ends up stirring a revolt against Brutus and the Republicans. The scene is quite long and in many ways constitutes the climax of dramatic action, but I would like to focus on one particular part of the speech. And if you'll allow me to read this text, there's Marlon Brando, just to divert you from me, from my poor oratory skills. So Antony says this: I come not, friends, to steal away your hearts. I am no orator, as Brutus is, but as you know me all, a plain blunt man that love my friend. And that they know full well that gave me public leave to speak of him. For I have neither wit, nor words, nor worth, action, nor utterance, nor the power of speech to stir man's blood. I only speak right on. I tell you which you yourselves do know. Show you sweet Caesar's wounds, poor, poor dumb mouths, and bid them speak for me. But were I Brutus, and Brutus Antony, there were an Antony would ruffle up your spirits and put a tongue in every wound of Caesar that should move the stones of Rome to rise in mutiny. Pretty powerful speech, and I'm very happy to have had the opportunity to read it in the country of William Shakespeare. So what I find interesting about this rhetorical strategy is what might be called the denegation of oratory skill. Mark Antony is ostensibly a straight talker, a plain blunt man, and certainly no orator, as Brutus is. Mark Antony uses a strategy that is very familiar to us from the experience of contemporary populists. They steal people's hearts precisely by declaring that they have not come to steal away people's hearts, that they do not even know how to make speeches, that they can only speak from the gut. They tell it, I quote, like it is, end of quote. Mark Antony employs a rhetorical structure that legitimizes the speaker vicariously, with borrowed authority. The speaker merely assumes the position of a close friend of the deceased, and it is in Caesar's name, not in his own, that Antony makes his claim to power. More specifically, since he is no orator, he functions merely as the one who shows, rather than speaks about, Caesar's wounds. It is the wounds themselves that speak and stir the people to revolt. From the perspective suggested in this scene, political power, or put plainly, Antony's control over the Roman populace, is expressed through rhetorical or even theatrical structure. In Shakespeare's dramatization, it seems that power requires a theatrical form in order to become real or actualized. So this is the overall theme that I'm trying to address, that power requires a theatrical form not only to manifest itself, but in a way ontologically, in order to exist at all. The presence of the political master survives in the name of Caesar only. It takes the form of the name borrowed from a dead tyrant and is an appearance, a representation, an avatar. According to this rhetorical strategy, there is no master as such. There is no single person who may or may not appear to us as the master. The master exists only as his own appearance, as his own deadly wound. Now, there is another moment in Shakespeare's play in which the performative nature of political power is made quite palpable. In one of the early scenes, the senators are discussing the future of Rome behind the scenes of a grandiose public event in Caesar's honor. In the background, the senators hear 3 shouts of public jubilation. And it turns out later that it was some kind of political performance. So I'm just recalling what Shakespeare and Plutarch were reporting. In the background, they hear 3 sounds of public jubilation, and it's a performance. Antony offered Caesar a mock crown. He offered it 3 times, as if in jest, but Caesar refused it 3 times. This performance, described by one senator as, quote, mere foolery, and accompanied by Cicero muttering something in Greek. So apparently the senator didn't speak Greek, and so in his report, he was just saying, well, Cicero was just muttering something in Greek, like one would expect of Cicero. Anyway, this performance drew great applause from the crowd. So public officials who dare express republicanism are swiftly, quote, put to silence. This is what Shakespeare says. They are put to silence. Caesar rules de facto as king. Plutarch reports that the 2 tribunes that dared to remove royalistic decorations from the statues of Caesar were, this is from Plutarch, deprived of their offices. This is what Plutarch says. They were deprived of their offices. But by saying that they were put to silence, which is what Shakespeare says, Shakespeare adds an even more sinister tone to this incident, right? So there's clearly an air of deadly intrigue for Shakespeare. What interests me here is that Caesar gains, this is the core of it, that Caesar gains public approval and public consent for tyrannical rule precisely through the public show of rejection of the crown. So this is the idea. Antony offers the crown, he rejects it, and people jubilate it. This is the image that I find really interesting. In other words, Caesar legitimizes himself as king by publicly expressing outrage at this honor. Now, Suetonius, so not Plutarch, but the other commentator, ancient historian Suetonius, adds a further detail that fully supports this negative procedure. Suetonius writes, Caesar sharply rebuked and deposed them, those two officials who, put royal insignia on the statues of Caesar. Caesar sharply rebuked them and deposed them. And then Suetonius wonders, either offended that the hinted regal power had been received with so little favor, so either Caesar was offended that these tribunes did not like that he was treated with kingly honor, or, as Caesar himself asserted, that he had been robbed of the glory of refusing it. Okay, and I think this is the key, right? So Caesar wanted the glory of saying, please put down those royal insignia, that is not from us, for Julius. That's what he was after, the glory of rejecting the honor of being treated as king. Clearly, again, there is glory in refusing regal power. And it seems very plausible, of course, that Caesar was after it. Shakespeare makes great dramatic use of the theatricality of these events, but it seems that, and this is another big claim that I'm going to try to make today, but it seems that perhaps these historical events themselves were already theatrical. My point is that the legitimization of political power takes place as a strange kind of performance. The figure of the master, specifically of the king, takes shape through its own negation. All right, the second point I want to make about this speech, this specific part of Antony's speech, is about the intertwinement of the dimension of power and truth. So if the first point was about the theatricality of power, the second point is about the intertwinement of power and truth, which is another very contemporary concern, I think. Antony rests his argument upon the tacit assumption that truth does not require any embellishment, that making beautiful speeches and using the right words is not how truth is told. The strategy he uses is strategy of nuda veritas, the naked truth, where it is the facts themselves that speak. And what the facts say directly, quote unquote, speaks louder than words. Greek rhetoricians call this kind of public speech paresia, which can be roughly translated as saying everything, without restraints, freely. Following this form, Antony speaks right on and only, quote, shows sweet Caesar's wounds. If we take what he says and how he says it at face value, if we don't immediately assume that he is a Mephistopheles manipulating his audience, which of course he is, his theory of truth is perhaps surprisingly Platonic. In the Symposium, which is structured like a contest in giving speeches about love, so I'm going to go from Shakespeare now to Symposium. It's a dialogue structured like a contest of giving speeches about love, of eulogies to the god of love. Socrates begins his own speech by saying, I think, precisely what Mark Antony is saying. He declares himself completely inept at giving speeches. So I'll just read from Socrates now. From Plato, but Socrates' speech. So just before Socrates, recall that there was Agathon, the dramaturgist, the tragedian, who made a wonderful speech, a wonderful eulogy to love. And then Socrates is invited to speak. So I'll read this. I was afraid Agathon would conclude his speech by challenging mine with the eloquence of Gorgias, the brilliant orator, and, like the Gorgon, would turn me into stone, unable to utter a word. So I'd just like to underline this image of speech petrifying you. There's a speech that turns you into a stone, which, of course, I'm directly relating to the image we have in Mark Antony's speech, where the stones of Rome would rise in mutiny with the power of oration. Right? So it's like the Gorgon would turn me into a stone, unable to utter a word, says Socrates. It was then I realized what a fool I had been in agreeing with you to take my turn and deliver a eulogy of love. and in saying even that I was an expert on the subject of love, despite, as it turned out, knowing nothing about how to compose a eulogy of anything. And then he says the following: "For in my naivety," says Socrates, "in my naivety, I thought I had only to speak the truth about the subject of the eulogy." It now seems that the original proposal was not that each of us should really praise love, but that we should give the appearance of doing so. Okay, this is what Plato tells us. Now, the difference between truth and appearance could not be more pronounced. Socrates even seems to explicitly invoke the style of paresia when he says that he will speak, quote, "in whatever words and phrases happen to come into my head at the time," end of quote. In fact, Plato has consistently, as you all know, made the claim throughout his body of work that the truth will always defeat the appearance, that it ought to defeat it, and his epistemology as well as his political theory depends on the task of defeating it. So the truth must defeat the appearance. The whole notion of the quarrel between philosophers and poets over representation, mimesis, is Plato's way of arguing that truth has its value beyond appearance, and that all embellishments and poetic artistry must cede ground to truth. The question of good statesmanship is, for Plato, undeniably a question of knowledge, and by extension, a question of truth. This is why in The Statesman, so in a different dialogue, the discussants go to great length to distinguish true political art from mere imitations. In political matters, just as in matters of science, truth should triumph over appearances, true knowledge over sophistry. Now, Plato is accordingly somewhat suspicious of great oratory skill displayed in political matters. Okay, so he's suspicious of good talkers. The oratory skill can be useful in as much as it, quote, partakes of the kingly art because it persuades men to justice and thereby helps to steer the ship of the state, end of quote. However, another quote, the power of persuading a multitude or a mob by telling edifying stories, end of quote, must be subordinated to the art of statesmanship, which solely holds the power of deciding whether some action, no matter what, should be taken, either by persuasion or by some other exercise of force in relation to any person, or whether to take no action at all. It's a long way to say that Plato puts the statesmanship art, the political philosophy or political practice, if you want, to be more important than rhetorics. So it stands, on its own ground, so to speak, without the representation, the imitation, the rhetoric. So any value we may ascribe to rhetoric or poetry depends for Plato on whether or not it serves science and truth. And by saying that, whether he wanted or not, with his profound suspicions about oratory skill and with the general idea that truth is the ultimate authority, which is basically still today what we think when we think about science, Plato promoted an entire tradition of appreciation for straight talkers in the political domain. So what Shakespeare shows us in Mark Antony, in a clear rebuke of this Platonic tradition, is how the procedure of talking straight can very easily be used by populists to legitimize their positions, to usurp power. So it's the very strategy of distinguishing between truth and appearance that can be used to impose, terrible, tyrannical political practice. Plato was actually very well aware of this difficulty, but I'll make a bracket here. Or I'll not go into the bracket here, sorry. Now, another point to make would be that Socrates distances himself from his own speech, not only by refusing to employ an embellished language and structure, but also on the level of the content. Just recall that when he finally delivers his understanding of love, Socrates does not even speak in his own name. He uses the name of this mysterious woman, priest. Recall that in Symposium, it's just 5 men talking, mostly about their love to boys. And that's how they understand love. But Socrates then invents the woman. From somewhere, the woman appears, and she's the one who taught Socrates everything about love. So this procedure, I think, is showing us that authority of truth thus functions as a kind of borrowed authority. One does not simply speak the truth, one only lends one's voice to it. Ironically, in a kind of revenge of the appearance, Shakespeare has Mark Antony use precisely the same procedure. Antony also claims to be nothing but a mouthpiece of some mysterious, otherworldly authority. He is simply giving voice to the, quote, poor, poor dumb mouths, end of quote, which are Caesar's wounds. Just as a point of, we have to intercede with a little bit of comedy, maybe. Evoking this image of putting a tongue in every wound of Caesar, Shakespeare is turning those wounds actually, into an almost erotic object, right? So he wants to put his tongue into every Caesar's wound. And on this note, I just wanted to briefly point to Caravaggio's painting from roughly the same period as Julius Caesar from Shakespeare, which is depicting another JC, but we can see the eroticism of the wound, right? I hope it's clear that it's Caravaggio, so obviously it's going to be perverse, right? But I think the eroticism is pretty clearly there. So Shakespeare demonstrates efficiently and brutally that the fact that authority is bound to the category of truth, just as Plato suggested, does not mean that one can simply disassociate appearances from political power. And even today, if someone comes with an idea, all we need to do, is to speak about facts and, get the clowns and the performers out of the political arena, it's never going to be that simple. It's never supposed to be that simple. It will just never happen. Because clowns can always perform, this very same gesture. One cannot simply ban thespians from entering the political domain. Thus, it's never enough to speak the truth in order to win an argument, political or otherwise. One must also give the appearance of speaking the truth. Okay, my third point, and I hope I'm not taking too much of your precious time, I'm going to speak about the name of Caesar. Now, historians usually do not consider Caesar a monarch, even though he was obviously keen on ruling as one. Plutarch makes a really poignant remark by saying the following, I quote from Plutarch now, "Of the power and dominion which Caesar had sought all his life at so great risks, and barely achieved at last in the war against the Pompeians, civil war. Of all that power and dominion, Caesar had reaped no fruit, but the name of it only." Okay, so it's a play on words. He just reaped the name of power and dominion. Unfortunately, I'm one of those senators who don't really speak Greek, but I did check a little bit whether this is just a phrase in the English translation, but I think it's not. I think that the Greek text itself uses the reference to a name. So a hint of power and dominion. The name of it only is what Caesar was able to achieve. You know that it was Octavian who, after having defeated first the Republicans with the help of Mark Antony, and then having defeated Mark Antony himself, became the undisputed single ruler of the Roman world and the first true Roman emperor. Nevertheless, Octavian formulated his claim to power as Caesar's heir. This is how he justified his claim to power, adopting Caesar's name. And so the title of the emperor in many European languages, like in German, Kaisertum, it's clearly just using Caesar's name. The same in Slovenian, Cesarstvo, Caesar is like the emperor. Or in Russian would be Tsarstvo, which you've heard already, is just reference to Caesar. It's like Caesartum. Caesardom means empire. So quite literally, Octavian Augustus ruled as a Caesar, in a sense. As the second Caesar, but the first undisputed emperor. And this is not the only time the name of Caesar plays a significant role in historical reports, both Plutarch and Suetonius relate an episode when commoners hailed him as king. So, he was doing this military parade through the streets of Rome, and commoners greet him, "Hey, king, Rex, probably." And he made yet another pursuit of gaining glory from rejecting the honor, saying that, "Oh, but my name was not king, my name is Caesar." This is both Plutarch and Suetonius report this. So he's correcting them. "I'm not king, I'm Caesar." That's what he says. So Caesar's heirloom was, in a certain sense, nothing but his name. And subsequent Caesars donned that name to rule as his heirs. Augustus, quite literally, he claimed to be his son, which was possible within Roman law. Others did that metaphorically. Now, Hegel famously described this interplay between Caesar and Augustus, the difference between Caesar and Caesar, between the original mutation and the series that mutation originated. Hegel formulated it as the historical repetition. Caesar had to be repeated, so to speak, in Augustus and other emperors, so that the Roman world would accept the rule of one as something necessary, and not as a mere coincidence in a person of Julius Caesar. Now, interestingly, Hegel might have been inspired in this thought, at least partly, by Shakespeare's impassive and impartial dramatization of Plutarch's report. I wanted to show you this just to... I'm probably sure you're aware of Hegel's claim about historical repetition and the reference to Julius Caesar, but I wanted to show this, this little comment that he makes. You can find it in the third line from the bottom. So he says something like, Brutus by Plutarch and Shakespeare, and then in a version, one of the persons who transcribed the lectures wrote Plutarchs Leben und Shakespeare, die ihn auf die richtigste, reinste Weise aufgefasst haben. It's not much, it doesn't say much, but what I find important is that he takes Plutarch's Leben, so Plutarch's lives of the famous people, and Shakespeare as co-equal sources of history, right? I mean, that's the fascinating point I find here. He doesn't see Shakespeare's dramatization of, oh, that's a different level, okay? He's not saying that, well, we can't take Shakespeare to tell us anything interesting about history. Not at all. Shakespeare is just as relevant as Plutarch. Okay, which I find to be a crazy Aristotelian almost claim, if you're with me on this one. All right, you remember that Aristotle makes this famous claim, which is weird in a sense. He says facts can never accomplish truth. It's poetry. Because of its generality, because it's able to provide concepts, poetry is much closer to truth. Whether you enumerate facts, you'll never get to truth. You only need to have a concept. And so Hegel is very Aristotelian, I think, on this point. But this is just a small, tiny argument. All I suppose I'm saying is that Marx's comment on the question of historical repetition in 18th Brumaire, I think he's not inventing things into Hegel. I think he's merely explicating them. So I suppose as a more general claim would be that history itself functions as a kind of a theatrical mechanism, which was something that I think Björn already hinted with his Teatrum Mundi question problem, whatever. Okay, speaking about the cunning of reason, Hegel argues that in history, ideas are enforced or gain reality only through and by the death of individuals. That it is the blood of individuals that is sacrificed on the altar of an idea. So someone needs to die for an idea to actualize itself. In the example of Julius Caesar, we can see very clearly how it was precisely the death, well, of many people, of course, but I think Caesar genocided, I think, 2/3 of the population of Gaul at the time, and then, got involved in civil war and so on. So there was a lot of blood. But in the end, he himself had to die. He himself had to die in order for the idea of Caesardom, Kaisertum, empire, to be established as a historical necessity. So Caesar does not matter so much as a living individual. He functions as the figure of the master precisely insofar as he is dead, precisely insofar as unlimited political power was his heirloom rather than his actual possession. In fact, Julius Caesar, as the king that never was, is a very effective figure of the master. And Hegel's concept of the world historical individual should be understood accordingly. So I'm taking for granted that you know your Hegel almost as good as you know your Shakespeare. If that's not the case, we can discuss it later on. Now, even though the point is not completely unequivocal in Hegel's lectures on the philosophy of history, I argue that one does not become a world historical individual, which is a concept he uses there for people like Caesar. It's not because they have a set of qualities or because they have achieved great feats during their lifetime. What makes such an individual what they are is that great historical feats and transformations became associated with them, or more specifically, with their name. As living individuals, they may have not even survived this process, or perhaps it was even preferable, like in the case of Caesar, that they had to die in order for the idea that they represented to succeed. Okay, so this was the part on Caesar's name. Björn, feel free to stop me. I have a few more notes. Go ahead. Okay. So I'm going to talk about the absolute master now. The absolute master. It's a phrase that Hegel uses. Now, in the course of his lectures on the philosophy of world history, Hegel refers to death in reference to the figure of the master only obliquely. He's talking more about wars, which have a very similar, actually, function within Hegel's political philosophy. Wars and death have a similar function. Elsewhere, however, Hegel does it much more and more directly. Notably, in Phenomenology of Spirit, in the passage on Lord and Bondsman, death takes center stage. So, I'll try to... Are we interested in Hegel a lot? I just want to hear, yay, Hegel, or no, please no. I see more of please no. So I'll cut this short, and I'll just cut this part of presentation short and just go to the... you probably are aware of his dialectics of master and slave, or lord and bondsman, right? So I won't go into those details. I'll just mention one specific point where he discusses how this relationship turns out around, on its head, if you want. Somehow it turns out that it was the bondsman that was actually an independent self-consciousness and not the master. What I'm interested in is how he justifies this reversal. Okay, so Hegel writes, "For the bondman consciousness has been fearful, not of this or that particular thing, or just at odd moments, but its whole being has been seized with dread, for it has experienced the fear of death, which is the absolute Lord and Master, or Herr. In that experience, it has been quite unmanned, has trembled in every fiber of its being, and everything solid and stable has been shaken to its foundations. By this pure universal moment, the absolute melting away of everything stable, but this pure universal moment is the simple essential nature of self-consciousness, absolute negativity, pure being for self, which consequently is implicit in this consciousness." End of quote. So the reason why the bondsman consciousness turns out to be superior, or the truly independent one, is because it has experienced death and somehow survived it. It survived its own death, in a sense. I won't go into Heidegger, but you can see already that Heidegger just copied from Hegel, basically, his whole philosophy of being and time, but gave it a little bit of a twist. I think for Hegel, death is very clearly a social phenomenon, Even when he's discussing the question of the lord and bondsman, he's discussing social relationship and political relationships, and so death is a socializing experience. Whereas for Heidegger's Being and Time, you don't have to completely agree with me, but there's an element of isolationism in death. So we are, in Heidegger's understanding of death, we are most, the words leave me, we are, Jemeinigkeit would be the German term. My death is always mine own. It's a kind of a singularizing moment and not directly and immediately social as in Hegel. All right. And I just want to make a note why I think this is relevant in contemporary situation, because this is where Hegel's understanding of death and its social function also corresponds somehow to Hegel's understanding of war and its social and political function in international relations. So Hegel is not like Kant, who that it was Kant who wrote, Zum ewigen Frieden, in favor ultimately of eternal peace. Hegel doesn't quite buy that. He says that even if eternal peace is something that we might want, it is not something achievable in this simple, direct, intentional way. It can only ever be a kind of a side effect. All right, so this is just a comment. Now, and I'll just conclude with a little bit of Marx, and then back to Shakespeare. So in a footnote to Capital, Marx writes about Hegel's reflexive categories, and he says he has this famous quote from Marx: "One man is king only because other men stand in the relation of subjects to him. They, on the other hand, imagine that they are subject because he is king." End of quote. A beautiful quote, and I think we can find it in Shakespeare already. I think this is a case where, oh, sorry, this is not, I forgot to put it in. Oh no, you'll just have to trust my words on it then. Sorry about that. I'll read from, does someone want to join me? Do you want to read Casca and I'll be Cassius? Do you want to do it?
To be honest, I think you should be Casca.
Do you want to be Casca?
I mean, do you have the text?
Yeah, I do have the text. All right. So go ahead, be Casca.
Indeed, they say the senators tomorrow mean to establish Caesar as a king, and he shall wear his crown by sea and land in every place save here in Italy.
Cassius: I know where I will wear this dagger then. Cassius from bondage will deliver Cassius. Right? Very simple, very clear. And then he goes on, but life, being wary of these worldly bars, never lacks power to dismiss itself. If I know this, know all the world besides, that part of tyranny that I do bear, I can shake off at pleasure.
So can I. So every bondman in his own hand bears the power to cancel his captivity.
Right, so every slave can ever just kill themselves, right? It's very basic. But then Cassius says the following: and why should Caesar be a tyrant then? Poor man, I know he would not be a wolf, but that he sees the Romans are but sheep. He were no lion, were no Romans hinds. We're not Romans hinds, I'm sorry. But thank you, Björn. Thank you very much for being Casca to my cousin. And I think you notice how this is already Marx. He were no lion, were not Romans hinds. The general philosophical question behind this is, of course, why is there slavery? Like, why don't people either kill themselves or take power into their hands? It's something that confused philosophers for a very long time, and I don't think we have a good answer today. Why do people accept tyrants? We don't have a good answer to this question. Why do people accept tyranny? For Cassius, as for Marx, the burden of tyranny is borne by the bondsman himself, and what makes the tyrant a tyrant is precisely the fact that the bondsman, in Hegel's words, still clings to these worldly bars, or to dear life. Okay, and just to finish, it has become somewhat fashionable to describe all social life as, in a sense, theatrical, since all social and political practices can be considered performances of sorts, where every actor is given a specific role to play. Now, if we put it this way, however, then the concept of the master that I'm proposing here would not designate simply another such usual everyday social performance, but rather the very operator according to which all other performances are executed. The element, if you want, of the curtain falling in the theater of everyday life. Now, in philosophy of right, Hegel argues that the political community requires a monarch, and his concept of monarch has been consistently described as a kind of a performative gesture. He's merely a ceremonial monarch, merely sanctioning the laws into power. But the question for me here in the end is Hegel's concept of the monarch basically the same as his concept of the world historical individual? And my answer is no. These are two completely distinct concepts. Okay, so I want to finish to enforce a little bit of this idea of the differences of two theaters. And I draw this idea from Zizek. Zizek writes in his contribution to the book on, so he himself wrote, I think, a postface to a book called Zizek and Performance. And he says, he opens actually with a claim that there's one way we can say that life is theatrical, and this is like the everyday social relations or political relations are in a way theatrical. We all know what to do in a situation which is like this or that. However, he says that there's a different kind of theatricality to be discussed, which is a kind of a historical in its nature. Okay, so he distinguishes this. He uses specifically a reference to a Western called White Buffalo. He's discussing, this Charlie Bronson Western from 70s, I think, where I would say that maybe it's just bad technology. But at some point they have this white buffalo, rampaging against Charlie Bronson. And it looks kind of bad. It looks like it's obviously a prop. It's not an actual bison, a buffalo. But Zizek reads it differently. He says that the whole thing is obviously staged. So the whole thing is very clearly, it's meant to seem like it's staged because it's meant to evoke that this is something traumatic for the main character. And he's basically staging his own encounter with the trauma. So it's a different kind of staging. It's a different kind of theater. This is what Zizek ends up with. When we're talking about something traumatic, which in a way defines our own subjectivity, our own selfhood, if you want, then we are speaking about a different type of theater. So we're not to confuse these two theaters. And I just want to conclude with a quip by Napoleon, which is another example like Julius Caesar, the beloved French emperor. So Napoleon, when he conquered Erfurt in Germany, he was approached by the emissaries of Erfurt, and they were good Germans, and so they called him Notre Prince, our prince, our ruler. And he responded to them, Je ne suis pas votre prince, je suis votre maître. So he told them, I'm not your ruler, I'm your master. So he's distinguishing these two functions, and I think in this way, Julius Caesar is not a good example of a monarch in Hegelian sense, but is a very good example of a world historical individual. Thank you very much.